of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of California. He got his bachelor's degree at the Indian Institute of Technology, and then his MS at Iowa State and his PhD at the University of Minnesota. And I try not to hold the Minnesota and Illinois against him, being Big Ten rivals. His research focuses on environmental hydrology and hydraulic engineering, as well as energy, water, and environmental sustainability. I've been working off and on now with Praveen for, I don't know, I think about 10 years. He was one of our original critical zone satellite seed grantees. He's the principal investigator of the landscape CZO. He's a pleasure to work with, and I watched him give a really great presentation at the quasi-biennial meeting last year, I think it was, and so I'm very much looking forward to his presentation today, Blue Revolution, Water Security and Scarcity in a Changing World. Praveen?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay. Thanks, Tim, and I believe everybody can see my screen. Just confirm yes or no. Can you see my screen?
Hi, Praveen. Yeah, we can see it.
Wonderful. Okay. So thanks for this opportunity to talk about this idea on water security. And one thing that I want to point out from the get-go is that generally when we think about water security, we are thinking about essentially drinking water issues. And I want to bring in both water quantity and water quality as two facets of the water security and scarcity challenge. And so what I want to do is basically talk about a few ideas that we already presented in a paper a couple of years ago. That's in Water Resources Research, the first one on the screen. And then we recently submitted one to Nature. And the theme of that is the critical transition in critical zone. And I do want to emphasize that since this is a critical zone in society talk, I will be inclined to bring in issues related to critical zone and connect them to water security issues. So in order to do that, what I would do is begin with the story of intensively managed agricultural landscape, basically to provide a specific example and some ideas that I will draw upon from that particular example when I discuss in the second half some of the broader ideas which are a little bit more abstract. So for those in the audience who are not familiar with the intensively managed landscape, it's shown on the screen there on the map. And this particular region that we're studying was glaciated and last glaciated at some parts about 12,000 years ago. So in critical zone studies, we try and deal with deep time and deep earth as well as deep coupling. And what we have been trying to do is to bring these elements together into our consideration of modern day dynamics of the critical zone and basically put it in context of the legacies on which it is built. So this particular graphics, which is probably a little too busy, aims to essentially show that this landscape that we are studying, which is basically the breadbasket, as we call it, has an interesting legacy. It was last glaciated about 12,000 years ago, and that's the temperature graph that you see. And overlain on that is some cultural periods to just provide that 12,000 years in a context of human evolution. And that is important because a lot of what we are seeing is impact of human influence. And that has happened pretty much in the last 200 years, which is a very short period of time. But nevertheless, it has changed the landscape in very, very dramatic ways. So if we go to the glacial history, this part of the landscape was glaciated, and the climate surrounding this landscape was very different. And so basically we had taiga and temperate grasslands. And as the glaciers melted, the climate transitioned. And as the climate transitioned, there was northward migration of vegetation and basically arrival of pioneer species, vegetation succession, arrival of trees, and establishment of what we describe as climax species for this region, which is prairies and wetlands. And this migration happened at the rate of about 100 to 300 meters per year. And following that, there has been a lot of wind-blown deposition, which is called the loess. And this loess makes this landscape productive, along with the organic development that has happened in this landscape. And the loess deposition is pretty broad in this part of the landscape. If you go west, it can be pretty deep, 5 to 10 meters, and more towards the east, it is more shallow. And it's not as deep as something like the Loess Plateau in China, which is 100 to 150 meters deep, but nevertheless, it has an important bearing on the productivity of the landscape. So wind-blown soil or loess deposited over glacial drifts, which supported a rich environment for diversity, biodiversity. And it also led to the heterogeneous development of vegetation, soil organic carbon, nitrogen, etc. And this part of the landscape is, because of the glacial history, has very low gravitational gradient, is pretty flat, and it also has very low energy input. It's a temperate climate. And so most of the development that took place had, where basically all the transformation took place in place. And there was very little lateral movement. And as a result, it was a transformation-dominated system. And transport was very limited, and residence times was very low in this low gradient landscape. So since European settlement about 200 years ago, this landscape has been modified tremendously. So what you see on the left-hand side, the dark blue lines are the stream networks that have been noted in the 1820s through land surveys. And then you see overlain on that is some of the light colored lines, which are what you can extract from digital elevation or LiDAR data at present. And so this area has seen a lot of modification, geomorphic modification, straightening of channels, which you see on the right-hand side, as well as extension of channels. So on top of that, there has been, this landscape has been underlain by tiles, which you can see the amount, sorry, that crashed. Okay, I will not play the video. But the point is that there's a lot of hydrologic modifications in this landscape. So on the right-hand side, what you see is an example of a straightening of channel, and these are periodically dredged to maintain the conveyance capacity.
Praveen, we don't see your slides.
You don't see on my slides.
No.
Okay, yeah. Okay, what do I have to do? Hold on. Give me a second. Okay, let me see if I can do that again. Can you see that now?
Yep. If you want to, yep.
Okay.
Full screen. Yep.
Yeah, going there. All right.
Okay.
Okay, so on the right-hand side on the top, what you see is an example of a straightened channel. And also you see the tile drains in there. And these have been straightened to increase the conveyance capacity, drain the landscape out, create an unsaturated zone, which will foster growth of and germination of seeds and healthy crops. But it also allows the farm equipment to move into the land early in spring so that the plants have a longer growing season. And these streams are periodically dredged, and if they are not dredged, what you will get is basically the more meandering type of a behavior. So the system has a tendency to move towards more natural behavior, but it is being held out of this natural tendencies through human impact. So what we basically say is that this is being held in tension or out of equilibrium between a push and a pull between natural tendencies and human desires and the associated human input in these landscapes. So because of these modifications of the landscape, which have been targeted towards agriculture, the residence time has been reduced. And so event scale dynamics are more amplified. Basically, you'll get more flashiness. And as a result, what we are describing here is that this landscape has switched to a transport-dominated system from a transformation-dominated system. Before these modifications, the residence times were very large. And as a result, event scale dynamics are amplified, dominant processes are very different, and the connectivity across the landscape, across space and time also is very different, which essentially has a very cascading effect across all processes. So what we have been able to do is look at the interdependence between carbon cycle, the soil processes, the nutrient cycle, water cycle, and ecologic system, and the interaction between them. All of them have been essentially modified because of human impact associated with land use and climate, farming and tillage, channel extension and straightening, tile drains and fertilizer applications, loss of wetlands and native vegetation. And together, these systems basically act as a very dynamic, interconnected system, but their timescales are very different. So what you see on the right-hand side is essentially water, which we have represented with very small gear, and because that's the fastest response system. So that gear moves very quickly. And then the next, you have the associated response with nutrients, and then ecological system, carbon system, and the soil. So you have these processes interacting across different time scales and across space scales, and they have a tremendous impact on how the system behaves because of the interdependencies. So for example, soil erosion from uplands and its deposition in the floodplains also removes carbon from the uplands and deposits it into the floodplains. And the removal of carbon then affects the bulk density of the soil, which increases, and it affects the water retention capacities of the soil, which decreases, and that further accelerates the water cycle. And the tile-driven gradient that gets established in the surface further moves the water into the soil system and out through the tiles. And the flashiness of the response coming from the tiles then basically affects the stream system, ecological system, and so forth. So I won't go through the details of the complexity of that interdependence, except to say that this system is intertwined across both space and across many, many timescales. And the modifications we make at one timescale has a cascading effect across other timescales. And so we're calling it basically essentially a critical transition of the critical zone from a transformer-driven system to a transport-driven system. And over the last 200 years, I mean, it's not just the human impact on the landscape, but there have been a lot of institutional infrastructure that have come about, essentially associated with the particular ecosystem service that this landscape provides. So if you look at the number of institutions that are engaged in various ways in these landscape, going from the farms to the drainage districts to soil water conservation districts to EPA, USGS, extension services, the markets, Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Natural Resources. There is tremendous dependence, or there should be, across these institutions. And the entire goal is basically you have these ecosystem services, which are called agricultural products, and that is of tremendous benefit to the society. But at the other end of the spectrum, you get these hypoxia outcomes and massive fish kills that happen periodically in the Gulf of Mexico. So the bottom line of this characterization that I have just given you is that the environmental outcomes have complex natural and human legacies that are not easily reversible. So whenever we think about environmental problems related to water security or soil or any other resource that we are looking at, we are often very focused on that particular resource without looking at the dependencies across space and time and the legacies and the kind of thresholds that these systems have gone through. And just simply reversing certain types of application or certain types of practices is not sufficient to reverse the impact and take our system to a more desirable goal. And that what I've illustrated to you is essentially from a water quality perspective, basically agricultural output of nutrients affecting hypoxia. But a similar story can be made for water quantity perspective for a different setting. So that brings us to the question of what is water security? And so basically, in my mind, water security is ensuring a short and long-term provision of adequate, affordable, accessible, and safe freshwater supply to meet the needs of growing human population and ecosystems. And it's pretty broad definition and should be. It's not a narrow issue because we need to deal with it in a fairly complex context. So this definition includes consumptive and non-consumptive use, sanitation, agriculture, energy, poverty and justice, economic development, public and ecosystem health, and risk management. And we need this kind of a characterization to ensure economic growth, social well-being, and political stability, both within and across national boundaries, which basically take into consideration things that are beyond just ecosystem services. So the challenge really in addressing water security is multi-dimensional. So from a scientific perspective, which we all deal with, it is quite a challenging issue, but there are issues related to technological characterizations, socioeconomic considerations, policy, and governance. So if we are to get a handle on this, really we have to address all facets of environmental challenge. So when we talk about the water security, the facets are multidimensional. We talk about food, sanitation and consumption, loss of water towers from climate change, energy and development, navigation challenges, ecosystem services, pollutions, dealing with extremes and risk management, both floods and droughts. So if you look at globally the issue of water availability, the map that you see on your screen shows essentially what would be described as scarcity of water. So wherever you see hot colors, I mean, there is at least some form of water scarcity, either physical water scarcity or economic water scarcity. And where you see the blue color, basically that says there is no water pressure. So as to say, I think California should be colored differently, but this is from the Millennium Ecosystem Report. Anyway, the bottom line is this is from a water, freshwater drinking water perspective, so as to say. But the moment you overlay a map of water quality, what you immediately notice is that wherever there isn't physical water scarcity, there is a lot of water quality challenges. And so particularly if you look at Europe and eastern half of North America, most of the agricultural driven systems have posed significant water quality challenges. So by and large, if you look at globally, you will see that most of the area either are dealing with water challenges in water quantity or water quality. And that's why I call them two facets of the same problem. So the question we can ask is, how did we get here? We can say that this problem was inevitable because of population increase, growth, and development. It's a problem created by our own solutions, infrastructure and waterworks development to support the green revolution, where the focus was on food security, but not so much the water security per se. And in many parts of the globe, that kind of policy is pretty dominant and has a significant impact on water challenges. A big example is India. A problem created by lack of social and political will, and this we can see pretty much on a day-to-day basis in our own country. And a problem of collateral damage. For example, climate change has a cascading effect on several other aspects. And an emergent problem from unexpected drivers. So basically, when the energy prices go up or went up a few years ago, there was a call for biofuel production, and that basically has a significant impact on water demand and land use, land cover change. And it's also a problem when collaborators became competitors. So essentially, during the Green Revolution, the food security or food production was supported through energy input and water input. But now, I mean, basically that kind of a synergistic approach is not possible. I mean, there is competition between food, energy, and water goals. And with the energy revolution or the sustainable energy issues with respect to bioenergy, that's even more complicated. So this is an issue of availability, use, and management, and it's also an issue of access, quality, and scarcity. So the key thing to acknowledge here is that it's not a natural systems problem. It's a coupled human natural system problem. So that globe essentially lays out the natural on the left and the human trade routes on the right as a basically surrogate for human activities and global connectedness. And that is also seen through various studies brought forward through virtual water trade ideas. And the top figure on the left-hand side by my colleague here, Megan Cunard, shows that US in particular is a predominant supplier of virtual water trade because of it supplies food to a large part of the globe. And that's also shown on the lower right-hand side that North America is the largest, one of the largest exporters of food. But that has implications. That has implications locally on water quality. So while we are feeding the world, I mean, we have to deal with the water quality issues locally. And this is a news item from March 6, 2017, where India has agreed to have special farms to feed the United Arab Emirates and develop infrastructure for export and grow food which is more palatable to the palates of the UAE population. I believe this is basically water for oil trade, but nevertheless, you see this kind of a connectedness that impacts local water and environmental challenges with pressures from further out. And India is already dealing with a lot of water challenges. So the question is, how do you cope up with these kind of pressure? But again, essentially, this is, as I said, oil for water kind of a trade. So this is another example of energy water nexus. So I think it's important to understand what these central challenges are. And the bottom line is exceeding the limits. The growth far exceeds our knowledge for predicting and managing coupled human natural systems in terms of consequences, in terms of emergent risk, and in terms of interdependencies. So in the way we have done our engineering and societal solutions, we have generally taken a very narrow view of what should be accomplished, how we should factor in the cost, and how we should pay for it. And we haven't taken a broad view to essentially analyze the dependencies across the systems, to analyze what risk will emerge and at what time scale, and what are the consequences for future generations, and who is going to pay for it, and so forth. So I think the way to deal with this is really look at the network of dependencies. And these dependencies arise through various means: public policy and investment, laws and regulations, market and trade, climate, water, energy, food, flow of knowledge and information through cyber infrastructures, and perhaps others. And so we always think in terms of systems approach. I generally have a reservation for that because systems have boundaries. And then when you put boundaries, you cut off things, or you basically assume that whatever is coming through the boundaries is invariant in time, and there is no feedback to those outside the boundary. But there is, over across space and time scale. And so I like the network approach a little better in terms of characterization and elucidation. And through this, basically the networks, you have flow of physical flow, such as material flow. You have information and knowledge flow. You have interaction between people through competition and cooperation. And you have policy and development all play a role in the way humans behave, and the way solutions are adopted, or the way discoveries are emphasized as to what are the issues in there. So the key is basically that this cascade of emergent risk and failures is a big unknown. And most of the time, we are dealing with water as a resource and not water as a mediator of interactions. And that is a big missing component that I've tried to emphasize, that we need to think about water not just as a resource, but as a mediator. And basically, the variability of water is an important player in all aspects of systems that are linked to water. So when we think about network, lack of information and the integration of these interdependencies across science and society, information and decisions, priorities and policies, these are dichotomies, resources and values, laws and evolving societal norms, economics and scale, and social and private value. There is always a sense of trade-off when we are thinking about these dualities. And we don't understand them just within a dual system. We don't understand them when they link across these network of dependencies. And as a result, we can get a cascade of emergent risks and failures. Some of these ideas have been characterized in an ecosystem context. So there is this paper a few years ago looking at planetary-scale critical transitions, basically trying to articulate that these systems are linked, going from the climate to the nutrient cycle to biodiversity, ocean, water resources, land. The graph essentially says that we are headed towards such a critical transition. The example I gave you from the critical zone story is essentially saying that we are past that critical transition already, and the system is in a very different state. And one of the consequences of the critical transition is that once you go past the threshold, reversing back is a very challenging problem because of the thresholds that the system has overcome into the transition. So that is an important consideration as we think about water security issues. So for lack of a better word, I call it a hyper-complex problem, essentially to emphasize that in the issues that we deal with, the cause and effect are separated in space and time, and sometimes generations. So what we characterize as cause and effect in terms of very short periods of time or the near short period of time of a few years, even that is too short-sighted. We have to be thinking about our implications over very long periods of time. There are often social barriers to effective solutions, and there are lots and lots of examples in modern day politics that we can allude to. I talked about emergent risk and hazards because the interdependencies are increasing. And as we make our systems more complex, there are new interdependencies that arise, which we are not able to anticipate. And they get triggered under extremes often, be it floods or droughts or fires or insect attacks or so forth. And they have emergent consequences at all scale. And it's not a problem of somebody else. It is our problem, it's our societal problem, it's our generational problem. And they arise because we are, again, faced with this duality of choices, whether we want to have growth now or intergenerational equity. We have figured out a way to borrow money from the future and spend it now, and that wreaks havoc. There is a duality of choice of conservation and progress. And there is a link between global drivers and local response, as we saw with the virtual water trade example. So I think there is an opportunity to learn from the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution happened because of significant development which converge. The Haber-Bosch process for fertilizer production increased productivity, high-yield seeds increased productivity, dams and canal system made irrigation possible and resulted in intensive irrigation, and pesticides and herbicides further increased productivity along with the mechanization. And these are independent systems that came together to address the food security challenges. The food security challenges remain because our population is headed to 9 billion people in the next by 2050. So we have to meet the food demand, but we cannot disengage from the water story. I mean, that is the duality. So much like we had the Green Revolution, I think we really need a Blue Revolution, and we need a framework for integration across ideas and across systems and across our understanding of how these things work. So I think there is a need for integration across discovery science and engineering, interoperable observation systems, information and knowledge systems, so we can make appropriate decisions. I think the simulation and communication of information and computational approaches are fundamental to finding these solutions. And I can't emphasize enough that our social and institutional networks, we saw an example with the intensively manned landscape where we saw many institutional networks operating. They have to be agile, they have to be responsive, they have to be working together, they have to have a feedback between the problem and short and long-term solutions. And I think the more we can blend these two all together, the more we will be able to have see the impacts of the progress of science, such as the advances that we are seeing in the critical zone, and have societal impact. So essentially, what I'm arguing for is that water security is a policy imperative. Much like several countries had food security as a policy imperative, and all the infrastructure development was targeted to ensure food security. Similarly, we do need water security as a policy imperative, and it will have an impact across many scales. So at the individual level, it will provide affordable access to sufficient and safe water to lead clean, healthy, and productive life. At the local level, it will provide protection from overuse and hazards of floods and drought. production of economic goods and ecological services, and prevention of environmental degradation. At the national level, it will ensure economic growth and social well-being, including food security. At the regional level, it will provide equitable negotiated agreements for water rights to avoid regional and international conflicts. And at the global level, provide stability for products and services. So I think having water security in the balance of a policy will have a significant impact. So with that, I want to thank you. Water is celebrated across the globe in many different ways, and we hope to keep it that way. Thank you very much.
So everyone, at this time, we have a little time for questions and comments. You can unmute yourself using the icon in the bottom left. So go for it.
Praveen, this is Tim.
Hi, Tim.
Thanks for giving the presentation. I have a question. It's sort of vague and wide-ranging, maybe, but I'm sitting here in the basement of the library at Cal State Bakersfield, and you know, on the edge or very close to the part of California that still is reported to be in drought. Certainly has suffered some 4 or 5 years of drought. And yet everything here is lush and green, and the rivers are running and the reservoirs are all full. And so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on, you know, how do we go about convincing society, I mean, let alone leaders and policymakers, that what you've just told us about water security is an important issue?
Yeah, Tim, I mean, I don't know the answer or how do we go about convincing. I mean, I think we do need to work at different levels, and different groups of people have to work. I mean, as a scientist, I find, or engineer, I find myself not speaking the same language as some of the other people. And I think we have to have people who speak similar languages and who can convince that basically water is the underpinning of economic development. And I think a big part of it comes because water is not priced, and for good reasons and for bad reasons. I mean, in some part of the US it is, in others it is not. And economists, when they model and they provide projections, I think those models lack in many, many ways on how water works in very complex ways. And whether pricing is a good thing or not is also a matter of debate. So somewhere, I think we need to have essentially some, I don't know, compelling documents put together, such as through NRC or other venues, which start to increase the drumbeat associated with water security. And I mean, we do have to deal with this legacy question. I mean, I talked about landscape legacies, but I think water right legacies are also a challenge, pose significant challenges to water security. So it's a complex problem, but I think we really need to sit around and start talking about water security policy rather than just water security.
Have you run your ideas by any economists?
Have I run my ideas by any economists? About 5-6 years ago, I was talking to one of the members of the advisory committee of the Prime Minister of India. So the Prime Minister of India at that time, Manmohan Singh, he had an advisory committee of about 12 people. And they basically gave him advice on all kinds of stuff related to all aspects of economic development. And one of the people I talked to, I said, yeah, you really need a water security as a policy imperative, because food security is guiding India's development. And essentially, that is wreaking havoc on water issues there. And his response was, it's a good idea. Can you articulate it better? And can you tell us exactly what to do and how to do this thing? So at that time, my idea was more nascent than what it is now. And that body has disappeared. The prime ministers have changed, and the way these systems function are very different. So the thing is, the short answer is yes, and the long answer is we need a coherent story put together so that such documents are readily available for somebody who may be interested, and say, hey, here are the ideas that you can take home right now. I don't think we have that yet.
I've become somewhat cynical as I've aged, and it just seems to me that if you can put dollars, values to this stuff, you know, it gets people's attention that otherwise might not listen, and more often than not might be in positions of power to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough challenge. I mean, yeah, I mean, I am hard pressed to give you specific approaches, except to articulate that we have to figure out a way to do that. What mechanism we use from a perspective of us being scientists versus getting social scientists on board and economists on board or things like that, and have a dialogue which may have a lasting impression. That's a tough one.
Anyone else have any questions? Now is a good time to ask.
Okay, looks like no one wants to step up.
Well, in the absence of any questions, Praveen, I'm going to thank you for presenting to us and remind everybody that we have another webinar in 2 weeks. Roger Bales will follow up with conversations about water. And thanks for participating. And before we close, you can still ask a question. All right, thanks, Praveen.
Thanks, Tim.
See ya.
Thanks, Praveen.